Hello class, I'm going to talk in this video about William Shakespeare's King Henry VI, the second part of a trilogy of plays about Henry VI. And in order to make this play, this trilogy, intelligible, we have to put this into a much larger historical context. So this play is actually part of a tetralogy of plays that includes the three Henry VI plays, parts 1, 2, and 3, and Richard III. And together, the four plays tell almost chronologically the story of the Wars of the Roses. This was a series of civil wars over rival claims to the English throne, and they were fought between the houses of Lancaster and York, two rival branches of the House of Plantagenet, which had ruled England since the accession of Henry II in 1154. So almost 3 centuries go by. The conflict starts around 1455 and would last until the defeat of the last Plantagenet king, King Richard III, at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485. So the wars lasted about 30 years. He was succeeded, after his death, he was succeeded by Henry VI's half-brother, Henry Tudor, who became Henry VII and married Edward IV's daughter. This would be York's granddaughter and Richard III's niece. Her name was Elizabeth of York. So Henry VII married Elizabeth of York. That united the two families, the House of Lancaster and the House of York, and established the Tudor line of monarchs that would end with Queen Elizabeth I in 1603. Did you get all that? I'll talk about it a little bit more in a little bit more detail here. So let's start with the House of Plantagenet. Really, this begins, a good place to start is King Edward III. And you'll notice his arms there on the right. There are 2 quarters that are red with the lions, and then 2 quarters that are blue with the fleur-de-lis of France. And that's because English kings in the Middle Ages had claims to territories in France. Ever since the Norman conquest of 1066, English kings had territories in France, and starting with Edward III's reign, there began to be conflict over who had the right to rule what, essentially. And these wars would continue sporadically for over 100 years, and that's the backdrop for some of the discontent that we encounter at the beginning of Henry VI, Part 2, where they're discussing Henry's marriage to Margaret of Anjou and the loss of certain territories as part of that arrangement. And there's a lot of discontent amongst the nobility about the loss of these French lands, which some of them had actually fought for and spilled blood for. There's a picture of Edward III. So he would have 3 sons. Well, he would have a number of sons, but the 3 oldest ones, the eldest, Edward, Prince of Wales, and then I think he had another son in here. I can't remember his name, but he died in infancy. And then Lionel, Duke of Clarence, and then John of Gaunt. He was born in Ghent, so Ghent, the Duke of Lancaster. So these were the 3 oldest sons of Edward III. And Edward, Prince of Wales, did not survive his father, but when Edward III died, the Prince of Wales's son, Richard, acceded to the throne of England, King Richard II. However, one of John of Gaunt's sons, Henry Bolingbroke, led a coup and wound up defeating King Richard II. He was killed, and then Henry Bolingbroke became King of England as Henry IV. And this is actually the subject of another group of history plays by Shakespeare, two parts of King Henry IV and Richard II. But this established the House of Lancaster as the line that would occupy the throne of England, and they wore the badge of the Red Rose. So we haven't said anything about the middle child here, the Lionel, Duke of Clarence, who didn't have any sons. He had a daughter, and her name is Philippa, and she married a man named Edmund Mortimer, and from them descended Richard, Duke of York, who's in this play. By the time that Richard Duke of York is an adult, there he is. Henry VI is now on the throne of England. And of course, as you read the play, there's Henry VI. These are anachronistic portraits. These are not portraits from the life. They are 16th century portraits, but charming. So the Duke of York begins to develop this claim to the throne of England based on this seniority, essentially, of Lionel, the Duke of Clarence. And this establishes the House of York, and their badge was the White Rose. And this is where the Wars of the Roses comes from, these two heraldic badges. Richard, Duke of York, would have several sons, two of whom are at play here. The oldest was Edward, who eventually succeeded in the Wars of the Roses in, there he is, in overthrowing Henry VI. Henry VI is killed, actually, by Edward's younger brother, Richard. And Edward takes the throne of England. But then Edward himself is killed, and he's killed by this man, who is his younger brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who becomes King Richard III, not for long, just from 1483 to 1485, and then he is killed, and then that ends the Wars of the Roses, because Henry VII takes the throne with Elizabeth of York. So where did Shakespeare get all this information? He had a couple of sources. This is one. I like this one because it has this just beautiful title page, which I'll talk about in just a minute. But this is called The Union of the Two Noble and Illustrious Families of Lancaster and York. It went through several editions and variations between 1542 and 1550, so long after the Wars of the Roses had ended, by a man named Edward Hall. Another source for Shakespeare was the Chronicles of England, Scotland, and Ireland by a man named Raphael Holinshed, and this came out in 1577. So these two books were a very important source for Shakespeare in writing his history plays. But I want to look back at this title page. What I like about it is it shows the family trees of the House of Lancaster and the House of York. And I like that they're all, their bodies are all blooming out of these roses. We'll come back and look at this in future videos, looking at some of the other history plays. But for now, just there's Henry VI, the main protagonist, and there's the antagonist, the Duke of York, down there. So let's talk a little bit about the history of the publication of the play. It's like many of Shakespeare's plays. It's pretty complicated. The histories, a lot of the history plays, came out in quarto editions, closer to the time of their early performance. The Henry VI plays scholars believe are probably amongst Shakespeare's very first plays. If you buy contemporary anthologies, collections of Shakespeare's work, the Henry VI plays are usually pretty early, um, if they're presented chronologically. So here is the quarto, the small, fairly small compared to the folio, edition of the play that came out in 1594. And you'll notice it's called the first part of the contention betwixt the two famous houses of York and Lancaster, with the death of the good Duke Humphrey, and the banishment and death of the Duke of Suffolk, and the tragical end of the proud Cardinal of Winchester, that would be Beaufort, with the notable rebellion of Jack Cade, and the Duke of York's first claim unto the crown. Quite a title. What's most noteworthy about it, though, is it says it's the first part, and the way the play is presented today is presented as the second part. Scholars believe that the first part of Henry VI was written after parts 2 and 3. I don't want to get into that debate in this video. It's complicated. If this is something you'd like to explore, there's lots of research about this. But that's why it says the first part of the contention there. There were a couple of more quarto editions of the play. I think there was one in 1600, and then it appeared again around 1619 after Shakespeare's death, with part 3 of Henry VI. And then all three were presented chronologically in the 1623 folio edition. And there are some pretty substantial differences between the 1594 quarto text and the folio text of 1623. So what I've put up here on the screen are just some photographs that I took of some facsimiles I have of the quarto editions. And I'm just going to show you some differences between the quarto and the folio. So here on the left, these scenes are when Margaret and Beaufort and the others are contemplating killing Gloucester. And this line from the Queen, these lines right here, she says, "Suffolk, remember what you have to do, and you, Lord Cardinal, concerning Duke Humphrey, 'twere good that you did see to it in time. Come, let us go, that it may be performed." So she's basically saying, it's time to kill him, and these lines are completely absent from the folio text. And here, even more dramatic is you see here the description of the actual murder of Gloucester. The curtains are drawn, and Duke Humphrey is discovered in his bed. 2 men are lying on his breast and smothering him in his bed, and then enter the Duke of Suffolk to them. Well, in the folio text of 1623, none of that happens on stage. Instead, the murderers run onto the stage and say, "Run to my Lord Suffolk, let him know we have dispatched the Duke as he commanded." So very, very different presentations of Gloucester's murder. 1594, the audience sees the murder on stage, presumably, and then that was removed from the folio text. And it's interesting to think about, perhaps why that was done. And there are the lines. Here is another passage. This is a passage that is the scene where Jack Cade, the rebel, he leads the artisan rebellion in Act 4 of the play, and that gets put down, and he flees and goes into hiding in the garden of this man named Alexander Iden, who has this speech about his garden and about the country life versus life in the court, which is right here. "Good Lord, how pleasant is this country life, this little land my father left me here, with my contented mind serves me as well as all the pleasures in the court can yield, nor would I change this pleasure for the court," he says. And in the folio text, that speech is significantly longer. Several more lines get added to it. For example, the last two lines there, sufficeth that I have maintains my state and sends the poor well pleased from my gate. So some additional lines get added to Aiden's speech there. And I think this is significant because Alexander Aiden's a really interesting character and someone that I think would have been very close to how Shakespeare perceived himself and his family. He owned a home in the country, away from the city, and I think that Shakespeare would have felt some kind of class kinship with the character Alexander Aiden. So interesting that his speech grows from the quarto text to the folio text. And we'll look at one more here. This is the encounter in Act 5 between York and Clifford. And in the quarto version, they are very, very hostile towards each other. York says, "Be this the day of doom to one of us, for now my heart hath sworn immortal hate to thee and all the house of Lancaster." And Clifford says, "And here I stand, and pitch my foot to thine, vowing never to stir till thou or I be slain. For never shall my heart be safe at rest till I have spoiled the hateful house of York." Well, in the folio text, that completely changes. They're almost polite to each other. They exchange compliments. That doesn't mean they're not enemies, but before they fight, they exchange these kind of chivalric compliments to each other. And then the end is the same, of course. York kills Clifford, but he ends with this line. It sounds like a prayer almost over the dead Clifford. "Thus war hath given thee peace, for you art still peace with his soul. For you art still peace with his soul, heaven, if it be thy will." So wishing him eternal rest. And that is obviously a big difference from the quarto version. And I'm going to talk about a little later in this video why I think that change is so significant. It has to do with this contrast between York and his youngest son, Richard. So before we look at some specific acts in the play, some specific scenes, and talk about them, I just want to touch on some of the major characters and give a summary of the play. So obviously, King Henry VI, the main character in the play, and his wife Margaret of Anjou. The play actually begins with their marriage, which is portrayed here in the illustration in the background. And this was all negotiated by another man named the Marquess of Suffolk. And he was the one who negotiated the terms of the marriage. And actually, we find out later that he and Margaret have fallen in love with each other and have been having clandestine liaisons, I guess, while she's been married to Henry. Then there is Humphrey, the Duke of Gloucester, who was the Lord Protector of England while King Henry VI was a child. And Henry VI was crowned King of England when he was like a year old. He couldn't even walk yet, and he was the king. So while he was a child, the country was ruled by his uncle, Henry V's brother, Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester. And that's significant because that a lot of characters see that as a threat, and Humphrey's wife, Eleanor, sees it as an opportunity. She wants Humphrey to actually claim the throne for himself, which he refuses to do. There's Cardinal Beaufort and the Duke of Somerset. These are Gloucester's enemies, and Somerset has another enemy in the play, and that would be the Duke of York. Even though it is York's son Richard that winds up killing Somerset in Act 5. But all of them are plotting together against Gloucester because he represents the biggest obstacle to control of the throne. York is allied with the Nevilles. This would be the Earl of Salisbury and his son, the Earl of Warwick. They are basically on York's side. In Act 5, they make it quite explicit that they support York in his campaign against Henry VI. And then two other interesting characters, Jack Cade and Alexander Iden. Jack Cade leads the revolt and then winds up getting killed by Alexander Iden in Act 4. So before we talk about specific scenes, I think it might be helpful just to get a summary of the play. I was going to say quick summary. Let's see how quick it is. But Act 1 is in 4 scenes. So King Henry VI and Margaret of Anjou are wed. Many believe that the terms of the marriage are way too favorable to France, that the territories have been ceded to France. With whom England has been at war for over 100 years, going all the way back to Edward III. Among those who disapprove of this marriage is the Duke of Gloucester, who served as Lord Protector during Henry's minority. Gloucester's political enemies, led primarily by Cardinal Beaufort, see this division as an opportunity to challenge Gloucester's influence and power, and they see that right away. The Earl of Salisbury and Duke of York will stand by Gloucester, although York does it for his own sort of duplicitous reasons. And Gloucester's wife, Eleanor, meanwhile, is pressuring Gloucester to seize the crown for himself. Gloucester remains loyal to Henry. He rebukes her pretty sternly, says, no, Henry is my king, and I'm going to serve him honorably. And Gloucester comes across in this play as sort of a shining star in a universe that's full of corruption and darkness. Gloucester has proved quite popular with the commoners of England, and this is shown in a scene where several of them come. They seek him out to resolve various disputes. And it's interesting that many of those disputes involve corrupt nobility. Conflict grows between Gloucester and Beaufort over how to deal with France. And Eleanor, who's eager to learn her husband's political fate, consults with a witch, and this turns out to be a big setup. And she's arrested, and it's all part of a scheme to tarnish and dispose of her husband. Eleanor is kind of a prototype of Lady Macbeth. Act 2 is 4 scenes. It starts at St. Albans. Gloucester, he endures, they're out hawking, and he endures further insults from Beaufort. And there's this miracle, this strange episode where there's this miracle, this man is cured of his blindness, or claims to be, and Gloucester exposes it as this big fraud. At this point, he receives word of his wife's arrest. And meanwhile, the Duke of York asserts his claim to the throne and forms an alliance with the Nevilles, the Earls of Salisbury and Warwick. And then Eleanor is convicted. She's banished to the Isle of Wight. Gloucester is, because of this, he winds up being deposed as Lord Protector. And then as Eleanor and Gloucester part ways, she warns him of the political danger that awaits him, but he naively dismisses her concern. And that'll be one of the scenes we look at in a few minutes. Act 3 is 3 scenes. Margaret and Beaufort's co-conspirators resume their slanders against Gloucester. They accuse him of all kinds of things. But the one that really sticks is the charge that he's embezzled money that should have gone to English forces in France, that he's the one responsible for continued setbacks in that country. Gloucester is arrested. But anticipating that the king will soften and protect Gloucester, and also recognizing that Gloucester is quite popular amongst the commoners, Beaufort and Suffolk plot his assassination. At the same time this is going on, York has been given a bunch of troops to pacify unrest in Ireland. And this plays right into his hands. They give him an army that he will later use to try to overthrow the king. And he reveals his plan at this point to overthrow Henry, using Jack Cade to incite a popular rebellion first. And then we'll see how it goes. And then if it looks like it will work, he says, then I'll come in and finish the job. Gloucester is murdered in his bed. Henry and Warwick come out and accuse Suffolk of the crime, which is not wrong. And Margaret, who's been carrying on an affair with Suffolk, defends Suffolk. Warwick and Suffolk prepare to fight, but they're interrupted by a mob of commoners demanding retribution for Gloucester. Henry goes ahead and banishes Suffolk to appease that mob. And then Beaufort suffers a very different fate, kind of interesting. It's like God struck him down. He dies suddenly and painfully in his bed. So Act 4 is very busy, 10 scenes, the most in the play. En route to France, Suffolk's ship is ambushed by pirates. He's recognized as a traitor to the king. They chop his head off. Later, Margaret will carry that head around on stage. It must be a very macabre scene. Jack Cade musters an army of Kentish artisans and leads a revolt. He has a really successful battle against a man named Stafford, and after that, he turns his forces towards London. Henry wants to bring the conflict to a peaceful resolution, but Margaret's walking around cradling Suffolk's head, and she wants revenge for his murder. They wind up having to flee London because Cade is successful. He captures the city, but in the process, he becomes increasingly savage and megalomaniacal. This does not work to Cade's advantage, and appealing to the commoner's sense of patriotism, the king's ambassadors succeed in negotiating a truce with many of the rebels. Defeated, Cade flees the city. Meanwhile, however, one problem begins to go away, and then another problem comes up, and that is York, who's returned from Ireland with his army, and he is marching toward London. And then Cade, in the last scene, is killed by Alexander Iden, has his head chopped off, and then Iden brings the head to the king and is knighted for it, actually. Act 5 is quite brief. The Duke of York, supported by the Nevilles and his own 2 sons, typo there, Edward and Richard, proclaims himself the legitimate king of England, and the Wars of the Roses effectively begins now. And then Henry's forces are defeated at the first battle, the Battle of St. Albans, in 1455. York's major rival throughout the play, they constantly antagonize each other, Somerset, is killed by Richard, who proves even more brutal and bloodthirsty than his father. And then at the very end, Henry and Margaret flee St. Albans and go back to London. So the scenes that I want you to know, I want you to be responsible for, we're going to look at some of York's scenes first. A couple of these involve soliloquies. This first one is a soliloquy. Act 1, Scene 1, lines 213 to 58. A soliloquy, of course, is occurs when an actor is alone on the stage in his part. All the other characters leave, and the character speaks. I don't want to say directly to the audience, but in a way that sort of reveals the inner workings of the character's mind. It gives the audience insight into the character's motivations, and mental state. So this first one, at the end of the very first scene of the play, York is expressing his grievance with the king and reveals his intention to usurp the throne. So the audience knows right off the bat what York is up to. He's got this great passage when he says, "Then will I raise aloft the milk-white rose, with whose sweet smell the air shall be perfumed." He justifies this in the next act, in scene 2. This whole scene, it's not a long scene, but he's meeting with Salisbury and Warwick and talking about his claim to the throne. And he goes through the complex family history that I shared with you earlier. Very elaborate. He does it very quickly. And this play is not a very funny play. Shakespeare interjects a lot of humor in some of his later tragedies, but there's not a lot of humor in this one. A little bit, but I think this has to be the funniest line. After Richard says, after York explains his claim to the throne, he says, "Did you get all that?" And Warwick says, "What plain proceedings is more plain than this?" And I think there's if I were directing the play, I would want Warwick to say that with a strong edge of sarcasm. And then in Act 3, at the end of the first scene, in the wake of Gloucester's demise, York's plan finally begins to take shape. We really see, it begins to crystallize for him what he's going to do. He says he's been given this army to go pacify Ireland, and he says, "You but warm the starved snake, who cherished in your breasts will sting your hearts." Great lines. And he lays out his plan involving Jack Cade, and how he's going to overthrow Henry VI. So that's an important speech that you should definitely take a look at. The next two scenes I want to talk about involve Eleanor and Gloucester. Scene 4 is the meeting between Eleanor and Gloucester right before she is banished to the Isle of Wight. And Eleanor, she really lets Gloucester have it for not supporting her. But she warns him. She says that Suffolk and York and Beaufort, they can't be trusted. They're going to come for him next. And he basically dismisses her. He says, "I must offend before I be attainted. And had I 20 times so many foes, and each of them had 20 times their power, all these could not procure me any scathe, so long as I am loyal, true, and crimeless." And of course, he realizes very quickly in the next scene, in fact, how wrong he is. Act 3, Scene 1, lines 1 through 222. This is where all of his enemies get together and accuse him of malfeasance, and he is arrested. He knows essentially that they're going to kill him, and he says, it's just in a kind of prophetic remark, anticipating the Wars of the Roses, he says that my death will be the prologue to their play, for thousands more that yet suspect no peril will not conclude their plotted tragedies. So really chilling lines before he is murdered in his bed. Act 3, Scene 2, lines 39 to 194. This is right after Gloucester's murder. Henry, Suffolk comes and tries in a sort of cold way to comfort Henry, who's very upset to learn of the former Lord Protector's death. He spurns Suffolk as a hypocrite. it's kind of, you could tell that he suspects that there's, something, Suffolk has somehow been involved in this. Eleanor defends Suffolk and goes into this lengthy complaint of her loveless marriage to Henry. And then Warwick comes in and he examines Gloucester's corpse. This is like an autopsy. He comes in and inspects the body and reports his observations, and he confirms what both he and Henry suspect, that Gloucester died as a result of foul play, and this leads to a confrontation with Suffolk that ends with Suffolk's banishment. Act 4, Scene 2, lines 59 to 101. Falsely presenting himself as a Mortimer, sharing York's noble lineage. This is all according to York's machinations. The rebel Jack Cade proposes reforms to extirpate court corruption and benefit the common people. And this is interesting because Jack Cade he's a complicated character, because on the one hand, he points out how the powerful abuse the lower classes, how the powerful exploit the lower classes for their own advantage. And the reforms that he proposes seem sort of outrageous and outlandish, but he is acknowledging legitimate grievances. On the other hand, he turns into a madman in the play. He says that my mouth will become parliament. He himself begins to become a tyrant. And when he starts defiling the severed heads of Lord Say and another nobleman that's executed, he's completely unhinged. And I think we're supposed to see that. And I think it shows Shakespeare's own hesitance to accept or approve of popular revolts as an answer to the grievances of the people. Shakespeare is often very suspicious of mobs. In any case, he is especially harsh, Jack Cade is, with educated men, like the court scrivener Emmanuel, who is executed. And it's almost an unintentionally funny scene. Emmanuel says, Cade says, can you write your name? And the clerk says, well, I thank God I have been so well brought up that I can write my name. And then everyone says, he's confessed. Away with him. He's a villain and a traitor, because he's literate, because he can write. And Cade says, away with him, I say, hang him with his pen and inkhorn about his neck. And I think what Cade and his group are getting at here is that the way that the powerful exploit the poor, the uneducated, is by writing laws and creating documents that common people can't read or understand, but that affect their lives. And there's a lot of anger and resentment about that. It comes through, particularly in the scene with Lord Say, which we'll talk about here. This is Act 4, Scene 7, lines 12 through 90. So increasingly violent and megalomaniacal, like I said earlier, Cade continues to condemn literacy, education, and printing as the weapons of the powerful, which is really interesting because Shakespeare himself was educated in a grammar school, a middle-class grammar school. He was obviously literate. He obviously supported printing and the publication of documents. And Cade and his group are deeply opposed to this. Lord Say is the founder of a grammar school and a paper mill. And for this, and for being able to speak French, he is beheaded. And then, as I said a moment ago, Cade defiles him, making these severed heads kiss at the top of their poles. A lot of severed heads in the Henry plays. Henry VI, Part 3 also opens with Richard and the severed head of Somerset. Act 4, Scene 10, lines 16 to 70. This is when Cade slips into the garden of a country squire named Alexander Iden, who eventually, albeit reluctantly, kills him and chops off his head. Definitely want you to go back and look at these lines from that scene. Already shared some of them earlier, comparing the quarto and folio text, so I'm not going to mention anything about them here. And then finally, this is the last scene I want you to study, Act 5, Scene 2, lines 19 to 71. This is where York slays Clifford, and then Richard slays Somerset. We already looked at the scene where York kills Clifford, and he offers that little prayer, God rest his soul, at the end. And then Richard slays Somerset, and Richard has very different lines. And I think one of the reasons why York's lines were changed was to draw this contrast with Richard, who says this after he kills Somerset: "Sword, hold thy temper. Heart, be wrathful still. Priests pray for enemies, but princes kill." That's a really strong, powerful couplet with which his speech ends, and that is very much Richard's character in the sequel to this play, and also in his own play, Richard III, which we'll read later. Young Clifford grieves his father also in these lines, and has great lines about war and swearing revenge. So that concludes this presentation on the second part of King Henry VI.